comes to discussing emotions, listening is essential. We need to listen for vulnerabilities and hear what goes unsaid. And just as important, we must show we are listening. Good listening, when it works, reveals new worlds beneath the surface of people's words. Chapter 3 explains how to listen more deeply and what to do when we hear someone say something meaningful. Chapter 4 examines how we can get better at hearing emotions that are unspoken, how our bodies, our vocal tones, our gestures, and our expressions say as much as our words. Chapter 5 explores how emotions can fuel conflicts or help resolve them, and how to create safer environments for discussing disagreements, both online and off. The How Do We Feel conversation is essential to connection. These next 3 chapters explore how to express and how to hear what we feel. Chapter 3. The Listening Cure. Touchy-feely hedge funders. The men and women filling the auditorium of the Connecticut Hedge Fund all appeared to hail from the same very expensive planet. Many wore bespoke suits, while others sported watches that cost more than some cars. As they waited for this invite-only event to begin, they discussed their recent art acquisitions and real estate projects, or groused about how the Seychelles and vineyard had become overrun. A few, in an effort to demonstrate their uniqueness, wore Kabbalah beads or limited edition sneakers. One person had a soul patch. But despite these attempts at distinctiveness, all of them, professional investors from dozens of Wall Street firms who oversaw billions of dollars, spent their days in much the same way, talking to CEOs and chatting up investment bankers, poring over economic reports and working hallways at industry conferences, always hoping to find some nugget of information that might help them predict which stocks would go up and which would go down. Today, however, was different. Today, they were here to meet with a 43-year-old psychology professor from the University of Chicago, Nicholas Epley, who had flown in to give a presentation on how to listen. All the attendees knew, many from personal experience, that poor listening skills could be very, very costly. One person in the room had managed to lose $20 million in a single afternoon after he failed to register that a broker, who was usually cheerful and inflammable, had yelled at a waiter during a 2-martini lunch and had repeatedly excused himself to answer phone calls. The man had offered a valid explanation each time he returned to the table, but the hedge funder later learned the man's firm had been failing and he had missed the clues. One tiny mistake, not hearing the hesitation in someone's voice during a meeting, overlooking an evasive answer to a straightforward question, could spell the difference between victory and defeat. So the organizers of this event had brought in Epley to help everyone get better at hearing what was easy to miss. Epley was just the person for the task because he had devoted most of his career to studying why we mishear one another. Why, for instance, were some people incapable of picking up on the emotions in others' voices? How was it that 2 people could attend the same meeting and then, afterward, completely disagree on what had been said? Many in the audience assumed that Epley would launch into a PowerPoint with a series of listening tactics. Always maintain eye contact. Nod encouragingly to show that you're paying attention. Smile a lot. In other words, the kinds of tips popular on late-night infomercials and social media accounts. But Epley's research indicated that such methods, particularly when forced, undermine real communication. Nodding doesn't mean that you're listening. Constant smiling and eye contact can be a little intense. Besides, Epley believed, everyone already knows how to listen closely. You don't need anyone to teach you how to listen to an interesting podcast or a good joke, he told me. When you're in a great conversation, no one has a problem following along. When something is interesting, you listen without thinking about it. Epley wanted to help this group tap into their natural listening abilities, which meant he needed to help them learn how to have more interesting and meaningful conversations. One way of doing that, he was convinced, was getting everyone to talk about more intimate things. In particular, he believed people should talk about their emotions. When we discuss our feelings, something magical happens. Other people can't help but listen to us. And then they start divulging emotions of their own, which causes us to listen closely in return. If the hedge funder who had lost $20 million, for instance, had inquired how his lunch companion was feeling, if he had pressed him on emotional questions, he likely would have heard that the man was stressed. He would have noticed clues that something was amiss. Epley wanted to nudge these hedge funders into a how do we feel conversation. When you open up to somebody, Epley told me, they get drawn in. However, Epley knew that many people shy away from discussing intimate or emotional topics because we think it will be awkward or unprofessional, or we'll say the wrong thing, or the other person will respond poorly, or we're too busy thinking about what the other person thinks of us. Epley believed he had found a way around these kinds of pitfalls. The key to starting a how do we feel conversation was teaching people to ask specific kinds of questions. The kinds that don't, on the surface, seem emotional, but that make emotions easier to acknowledge. Epley had spent the previous decade teaching people to ask these kinds of questions, and now he wanted to see if his techniques would work with a group of hedge funders, people who are usually allergic to touchy-feely displays. So as he stood at the front of the room, he laid out what was going to happen. Everyone, he explained, would be assigned a partner, someone they didn't know. And for the next 10 minutes, they would engage in a conversation. Then Epley revealed the questions that they would ask each other. There were 3 of them. The third one was, can you describe a time you cried in front of another person? Oh, shit, said someone in the front row. This is going to be awful. There comes a moment in many dialogues when you must decide, will I allow this conversation to turn emotional, or will I keep it dry and aloof? Perhaps you're discussing plans for the weekend with a friend, and during a lull they say, there's some stuff going on I might need to deal with. Or maybe you're catching up with a coworker and you hear a sigh hinting at sadness and troubles. Perhaps it's a reference to a family emergency or a mention of how proud someone is of their kids. At these moments, you face a choice. Are you going to let that comment go by without asking for elaboration? Or are you going to acknowledge the feelings that were expressed and respond emotionally yourself? This is when the how do we feel conversation begins, if we allow it to. Regardless of your decision, it's certain that emotions are already influencing your discussion. Numerous studies show that emotions come into play nearly every time we open our mouths or listen to what someone says. They influence everything we say and hear. They've already entered your conversation through that